Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Laura Shaw-Frank. I actually only know two of you, but maybe we'll just go around, everybody say your names, because that way I'll know all your names. Hi.
Lydia Freudenstein.
Sheila Goddard.
Hi. So my name is Laura Shaw-Frank. I teach here in the history department, and I also do Israel guidance here at SIR. I'm also, as I was just saying, working on my dissertation in American Jewish history, which actually deals with the 19th century, not the 17th and 18th centuries. But the 17th and 18th centuries really have a very warm place in my heart in American Jewish history. I think it's my second favorite period after the 19th. And we're going to focus on the 17th and 18th centuries here today and in the next few weeks, because I really feel like the Jews who came during this period were the Jews who laid the groundwork for a lot of what goes on today. We think that the groundwork was laid in the late 19th and early 20th century with that massive Eastern European migration that probably all of our families came over, and I know my family came over during that period of time. And that is true. It is really true that much of what we see today in the American Jewish community comes from that time. But there are a lot of really interesting sort of groundwork that are really, those foundation stones are put down in the 17th and 18th centuries for not only religious freedom for Jews, but also the Jewish desire to advocate for themselves and force America into being better about religious freedom. So it's a story of not only Jews benefiting from religious freedom here in America, but Jews contributing to religious freedom in America. And at the same time, it's a story of struggle, because it's a story that we know very well today about Jews living in a very enticing, very free culture here in America, something more free than they experienced anywhere else in the world at the time, and having to figure out how in this really free society they're going to deal with the issue of Jewish continuity. And we deal with it less in our Orthodox community than other Jews in America do. But even in our community, this is, of course, an ongoing struggle. And we certainly see with things like the Pew Study and other pieces of evidence that come out in the American Jewish community today that this is our number one struggle. So I really feel like these guys back then had a lot to teach us and a lot that we should learn from getting into that, their stories. So, Part 1. The American Jewish community is born. So this week we're going to talk about how the American Jewish community came to be. Where did they come from and when did they start? So American historians in general love to periodize, right? They like to say, this is when a period starts and this is when a period ends. And this period is a period because of X. So American Jewish historians all say, when did American Jewish history start? It started in 1654. Why did it start in 1654? There was actually a Jew or two here before in the late 16th century. We know, for example, there was a man named Joachim Gans, who was a Bohemian mining expert who came to this country in 1584. So why 1654? The reason that we settled on 1654, wasn't me, but those experts who settled on 1654 as the beginning of the American Jewish community, is because 23 Jews arrived that year. It's actually even 26. 3 came on one ship and 23 came on another. And when you have 23 Jews who come, and some of them are women and some of them are children, all of a sudden you have a community. When you have a few men who come to trade and then return to their countries of origin, that's a very different thing than having women and children who are going to perpetuate a community. It's also a very different thing when you have 23 Jews who are plunking themselves down in a place with the intention of staying, with the need to have a minyan, with the need to have a shochet, with the need to have a mikvah. So we date the beginning of American Jewish history to this moment because this is when the community actually began. So this group of Jews that came in 1654 has come to be known as the Recife 23. Why the Recife 23? Because they came from Recife, Brazil, for various reasons that we'll talk about in a few minutes. And they came, and there were 23 of them. So we call them Recife 23. It's sort of a known little phrase in American Jewish history. How on God's earth did we get Jews from Recife in Brazil? Oh, it's kind of a random place. We don't really know if there being a major Jewish community there today. There are a few Jews there still. So we have to actually go back a little bit. And we're going to go back to the 15th century just briefly to talk about the Spanish Inquisition. The Jews who lived in Recife and came to the United States, or America, not the United States yet, were actually descendants of Jews who had been expelled from Spain in 1492. So I know I don't have to tell you that in the late 1400s, Spain instituted an inquisition against conversos, against Jews who had converted to Christianity and were suspected of being fake Christians, that they hadn't actually really converted truly. And they had all kinds of inquisition courts for these people where they would say, I saw Mrs. So-and-so putting a white tablecloth on her table on Friday afternoon. I saw Mr. So-and-so not eating, such and such crayfish or whatever. And they would convict these people and kill them. During the period of the Inquisition, it became clear to the Spanish authorities that it wasn't working to have a Jewish community in Spain side by side with this community of people who had converted. Because as long as there are Jews still there, there's still a way to stay Jewish. There's still a Grunbaum's bakery. There's still a Jewish bookstore. You could still go to Pizza Block. And that's not going to work for the Spanish authorities. So in 1492, they signed a decree called the Alhambra Decree, where they say that the Christians who have Judaized and apostatized against our holy Catholic faith because of the connection between the Jews and the Christians, the solutions of inquisition, separation, and partial expulsion are insufficient as a remedy. We have to get rid of these people. As long as they're around, these new converts to Christianity are not ever really going to be Christian. They need to go. And so they expelled them in 1492. So this is something that people get very confused about. People always think that the Inquisition was targeting Jews. The Inquisition didn't care about Jews. The Inquisition was totally fine with Jews. The Inquisition didn't like Christians who had been Jews. And as a result of that, they expelled the Jews. Okay, so what happens to these Jews? They leave, and they go all over the place. Some of them, most of them, go to Portugal. And you can see on the map there's a little arrow between Spain and Portugal, right over here. The vast majority of them go there. It's easy. There's no mountain range. There's no water. Culture is similar. Language is different, but okay, most of them go to Portugal. Problem is that not that much longer after that, Portugal also instituted the Inquisition, although they did not expel their Jews. They didn't want the brain drain that Spain suffered after the Jews left. They liked having the Jews. The Jews were really good at navigation, and they were into colonial enterprise at that time, and wanted the Jews to stay. So they forcibly converted the entire Jewish community and wouldn't let them leave. So you can imagine how Christian those people were. They were not Christian at all. Those were already the people who had remained Jewish in Spain and had been kicked out. And now they're in Portugal, and they're forcibly converted as one huge community. They're Jewish. They're just totally Jewish. They only marry each other. They keep kashrut. They keep Shabbat underground secretly, and they really remain Jewish. They lose touch with rabbinic authority. They lose touch with sort of mainstream halacha. They forget a lot of things. Even to this day, they're still finding, I'm sure you've read in the paper sometimes, they find these communities, they're still existing, like in New Mexico and in various places in Central America. I read an amazing article about, they found a group of women who had the BRCA gene for breast cancer that Jewish women have. And it was like rife in this one random community in New Mexico, and they realized that those people had been Jewish. It was fascinating. So over time, they forget that they're Jewish. But for many generations, these people really continued to be Jewish. Other than Portugal, they go, you can see, all through the Ottoman Empire, all through here, North Africa. And ultimately, when they are allowed to leave Portugal, they go up to Northern Europe. And Northern Europe becomes a really great place for them for many reasons, not the least of which is that Amsterdam and the Dutch Empire is a very, very welcoming and relatively free place for women to live, for Jews to live at this time. Jews really flourished in Amsterdam, really quite amazingly for any place in Europe in the 17th century. It was really incredible. They were very financially successful there. probably responsible for as much as 8% of the Dutch Republic's total foreign trade. These little group of Iberian Jews, 8%. They were substantial percentage of the shareholders of the Dutch West India Company. If you think back to your middle school, colonial unit when you studied about the Dutch West India Company, the Jews were on the board of directors and held many, many shares in the Dutch West India Company. They were quite safe and quite prosperous in Amsterdam. It's really important to understand why that happened. Europe at this time in the 17th century was sort of swept by a wave of something called mercantilism, which was an economic philosophy that said that the country exists to make money. Now, that doesn't sound like such an innovative thing to say, but when you think back to the Middle Ages, why did the country exist in the Middle Ages? In the Middle Ages, the country existed to serve the king. The country existed to serve the church. It did not exist to make money. As a result of that desire to make money, that desire to export more than they were importing, countries were able to, for the first time, look past the fact that some of the best traders in the world were Jewish and just embrace them because they were going to make the money. That was the first step toward religious tolerance in Europe. This idea that, oh, yeah, they're Jewish. Yeah, we expelled them in the Middle Ages. We don't really like them that much, but they have trading networks all over the place. Let's go back to that map for a second. If you look at that trading network, imagine what's going on. Shmuel, Avram, Yitzchak, they all have brothers and cousins and friends in every one of those cities. And they speak the same language and they trust each other. They can write contracts with each other. They know nobody's going to renege. They can trust that it's going to happen. So, oh my God, the Jews are really useful. So that becomes a really powerful reason for them to be very safe and comfortable in Amsterdam. Additionally, Amsterdam itself had suffered from religious persecution when the Spaniards controlled Holland. And because of that, they were also kind of into religious freedom in a 17th century kind of way. And they also sort of allowed the Jews much more leeway than they would have allowed in previous centuries. So the Jews really did quite nicely in Amsterdam. In 1630, Holland captured a piece of Brazil called Pernambuco, which had been a Portuguese colony. And the Dutch West India Company, being that there were Jews, shareholders, etc., sent a whole bunch of Jews to go settle Pernambuco. So they did. And a whole crew of Jews, probably about 2,500 of them, ultimately settled in Pernambuco in a city called Recife and in its environs. They had plantations, sugar and coffee and tea, and they became quite wealthy and quite successful. They actually were between a third and a half of Dutch Brazil's total white population. So there were a significant number of people. They had ordained rabbis, which is more than I can say for this country because we didn't have one until 1840. So they cared about staying Jewish. They had an active synagogue. They had two Jewish day schools in Recife. However, through this entire period of time, Portugal wants to get that land back, and they're not happy that the Dutch have taken over Pernambuco. And the Jews are nervous about that. So over the course of years, as they fear that the Portuguese are going to come take back over, they leave. By the time the Portuguese actually successfully retake Pernambuco, there are only 600 Jews left. And you have to imagine what's going to happen with these people. Where are they going to go? Well, the rich ones are going to go back to Amsterdam. It's expensive to go back. It's a lot of money. It's a really far trip. So the ones who are rich and who care about being Jewish, they're going to leave and go back to Amsterdam. The ones who are rich and don't care that much about being Jewish are just going to stay in Recife. And then we have our poor Recife 23 who care about being Jewish but aren't that rich. So what do? They get on a boat and they just figure they're going to go somewhere along in the Americas, somewhere to some other Dutch colony, which will be tolerant of them and let them stay. So they do. Well, there's Recife. Over there, right there on the edge of Brazil. So they go up the coast. They stop in Jamaica. Jamaica doesn't want them. They stop at some other island. Nobody wants them. Nobody wants them. They're poor. They don't have a lot to offer. And ultimately they are fairly unceremoniously dumped on the shores of New Amsterdam, which, as we know, is now New York, our very own city. So what do they find? I have to say a word about New Amsterdam before I tell what happened to them. Obviously, we know New Amsterdam was a Dutch colony. We probably know that the governor was a man named Peter Stuyvesant, not known as being the most charming individual with respect to the Jews. So Peter Stuyvesant, just a little bit about him. He was born in the Netherlands in 1612. He was the governor of Curacao before he became the governor of New Amsterdam, and he became the governor of New Amsterdam in 1647. He did not have a great relationship to religious freedom, despite the fact that he was Dutch. He was not a fan. In 1657, he refused to allow Lutherans the right to organize the church, their own church. He also was very discriminatory against Quakers. So the Jews were in very good company, as you see when you see how he reacts to them. Peter Stuyvesant was very concerned that the Jewish settlers not be granted rights, the same as the Jews in Holland, because, what happens when you give those Jews rights and more of them come, and we don't want those people to come. So he's very worried about that, and he doesn't want them around. That's the world that these 23 Jews from Recife are going to be dumped into on September 7th, 1654. One other piece of information you need to know before we get to our Recife 23 is that less than 3 weeks before the Recife 23 arrived, another ship came to New Amsterdam. It was called the Pear Tree. It came from Amsterdam, and it had 3 Jews on it. It came in August 22nd. And it's amazing. They have these ship manifests with these people's names on it. It's incredible.
And their religions.
And their religions. Oh, yes, they were very into writing down everybody's religion back then. So among the people who disembarked were 3 Jews, Jacob Bar Simon, Asher Levy, and Solomon Peterson. They were all 3 prosperous traders who had come from Amsterdam, prosperous members of the Jewish community. At least 2 of them were Ashkenazi. There were Ashkenazi Jews in Amsterdam as well as Sephardi Jews. And Asher Levy was one of them, who was Ashkenazi. So you have these 3 Jews, you have Peter Stuyvesant, who's not a fan, and in come the 23. They arrive, and they can't pay the captain of the ship for taking them. So they offer him their furniture, which they've taken from Recife to bring to their new home, and he says, I don't want your furniture, I'm taking you to court. So he takes them to court in New Amsterdam, he petitions for the payment of their fare, and Peter Stuyvesant responds by seizing their few possessions and selling them at auction and jailing 2 of the Recife 23 as debtors. So not the greatest beginning, not a very auspicious beginning. He then proceeds to try to have the Jews expelled from the colony. And this is the correspondence that I've given you that I want to focus on today. I've actually put the key pieces up here on slides. There's a little bit more if you want to look in the correspondence there. There's more correspondence than I've given you here on the slides. But the correspondence is going to go like this. Peter Stuyvesant is going to write to the Dutch West India Company and say, oh, we don't want the Jews. The Jews of Amsterdam are going to write to the Dutch West India Company and say, nice try. And then the Dutch West India Company is going to write back to Peter Stuyvesant and say, sorry, you got to keep them. But we need to look at the language carefully to see exactly what's going on here. So this is the letter that Peter Stuyvesant writes to the Dutch West India Company on September 22nd, 1654. So this is like, they just landed, right? They landed on September 7th. By September 22nd, he's like, I got to get them out of here. I don't want them.
How long does it take to get a piece of it?
A long time, months, yeah, months. And it may never get there. And you know what, if it doesn't get there, it's not like anybody knows that it was supposed to come because the ship went down. It's not like, you're expecting it. You don't know. So I always try to, when I'm teaching kids about correspondence back then, it's like totally haphazard. And, the fact that all this correspondence survived is a miracle. It's unbelievable. Okay, so here's what he writes. The Jews who have arrived would nearly all like to remain here, but learning that they, with their customary usury and deceitful trading with the Christians, were very repugnant to the inferior magistrates and also to the people having the most affection for you. Also fearing that owing their present indigence they might become a charge in the coming winter, we have for the benefit of this weak and newly developing place and the land in general deemed it useful to require them in a friendly way to depart, praying also most seriously in this connection for ourselves, as also for the general community of your worships, that the deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ, be not allowed further to infect and trouble this new colony, to the detraction of your worships and the dissatisfaction of your worship's most affectionate subjects. Okay. What's he arguing? What's the reason that they should get rid of the Jews? They're awful. They're deceitful. They're money grubbing. He gives these vile sort of medieval stereotypes of the Jews. Like, this is the kind of discussions that went on about Jews in the 1200s, the 1300s, the 1400s. It's 1654. He's a little bit stuck in a previous time. So what is going to happen? Remember mercantilism. Remember that the world is slightly changing. And now let's look and see what happens. The Amsterdam Jewish community, now remember, they're totally in bed with the Dutch West India Company because many of the leaders of the community are on the board of the Dutch West India Company and are shareholders in the Dutch West India Company. So the Dutch West India Company gets the letter from Peter Stuyvesant. It takes about 9 seconds for the entire Jewish community to know that this letter was sent. And they're mad because Kol Yisrael Arevim Zel Hazeh, right? These guys are them, right? Not only are they fellow Jews, they're fellow Dutch Jews. They don't want this happening to them, and they're going to protect them. So what do they say? The merchants of the Portuguese nation, okay, the merchants of the Portuguese nation, that is just code speak for Jews. The Jews were called the merchants of the Portuguese nation by everybody in Europe. Everybody just called them the merchants of the Portuguese nation. And it just means Jews. Residing in the city is Amsterdam, respectfully remonstrate to your honors that it has come to their knowledge that your honors raise obstacles to the giving of permits or passports to the Portuguese Jews to travel and to go to reside in New Netherland, which, if persisted in, will result to the great disadvantage of the Jewish nation. It can also be of no advantage to the general company, but rather damaging.
It's pretty striking language, the Jewish nation.
Yes, exactly, the Jewish nation, right? Like, that's saying it's big, right? It's big stuff. You're going to damage the Jewish nation. Your honors should also please consider that many of the Jewish nation are principal shareholders in the West India Company. They, having always striven their best for the company, and many of their nation have lost immense and great capital in its shares and obligations. Okay. That's very nice that you think they're usurious and deceitful blasphemers of Christ. They're useful.
Yeah.
And you know what? They're shareholders. And you can't get rid of them because we say so. And we have money and we have power. And that's amazing. That's amazing because it's a new world. Because no matter how rich you were and how powerful you were as a trader in 1348 or in 1290 or in any of those years that Jews were expelled from Western Europe, it didn't matter. If you were Jewish, you were gone. Now, because the world has changed and because there's this economic model that's being put forth, all of a sudden, these Jews have a way of saying, I'm sorry, you can't treat us like that anymore. And it's not important that we're quote-unquote blasphemers of Christ. What's important is that we're shareholders in the Dutch West India Company, and you cannot get rid of us. So they send that letter off to the Dutch West India Company. You can just picture what was going on, right? Like the guys are standing in shul, right? And they're like, okay, we're gonna send the letter. We're gonna send the letter. And meanwhile, they're writing the letter to themselves, right? Because they're also on the shareholders and on the board of trustees of the Dutch West India Company. So they're writing the letter and it's for posterity and whatever else. And they give the letter to the Dutch West India Company, and the Dutch West India Company then responds. Dutch West India Company to Peter Stuyvesant, April 22nd, 1755. So also notice here how much time has passed, right? Because it takes 3 months for anything to get anywhere. So meanwhile, these poor Jews, they're like, eking out an existence. They don't know if they're going to be able to leave, or if they're going to be able to stay, or if they're going to have to leave. They don't know what's going to happen to them.
Are the debtors still in prison?
So I don't know, actually, if the debtors are still in prison, but I'm sure those records exist because the records are very, very precise. They probably were. they probably were still in prison. They were not treated well. I mean, until this letter comes back, and even afterwards, as we're going to
Unless
see.
the others who weren't in prison had
Somehow got them.
ransomed
Yeah, yeah. But they had no money either. Like, so they, unless they had somehow.
The first three had money, maybe Jews found out about Jews and helped them.
Oh, they did. For sure they did. We know that Asher Levy and the other two Jews, Bar Simon and Peterson, joined this 23, and they made one Jewish community. They're the founders of Shereth Israel, the
S&P.
Spanish Portuguese synagogue. Yeah, they weren't allowed to have a building. We'll see that in a little while, but they were the founders. Okay, so the Dutch West India Company sends a letter back to Peter Stuyvesant, and this language, I want to hear what you have to think about this. We would have liked to effectuate and fulfill your wishes and request that the new territories should no more be allowed to be infected by people of the Jewish nation, for we foresee therefrom the same difficulties which you fear. But after having further weighed and considered the matter, we observe that this would be somewhat unreasonable and unfair, especially because of the considerable loss sustained by this nation with others in the taking of Brazil, and also because of the large amount of capital which they still have invested in the shares of the company. Therefore, after many deliberations, we have finally decided and resolved that these people may travel and trade to and in New Netherland and live and remain there, provided the poor among them shall not become a burden to the company or the community, but be supported by their own nation. You will now govern yourselves accordingly. Okay, so what do you make of that? Like, why do they say we would have liked to kick them out?
We don't like them any more than you do.
Right,
We're
so,
stuck with them.
right, we're stuck with them. But it's interesting that they say that, right? Because the Jews are on the board. I have taught this correspondence for 12 years. I've been teaching this correspondence. And I've taught it in many, many, many settings, adults, teenagers, whatever. And it always puzzles me that they say that. Because I wonder,
I don't have a problem.
So tell me what you
say
think.
we understand, we're really we agree with what you say, but the circumstances are different here.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
But even though the Jews are on the board?
well, because they're trying to satisfy Peter Stuyvesant's comment.
Right.
They're on
so,
the board, but they're still Jews.
Right. So that's...
And they're not embarrassed to write this in a public document.
Right. Oh, for sure not.
The
Right.
Jews infect.
Right, right. So that's kind of what I think. I think that, they are still Jews. And I also think that, they have to control Peter Stuyvesant. That's another piece of it that I think is important. They need
That
to
last
control
sentence.
him. And he's a loose cannon in some ways. I mean, he's not really on board with this whole religious toleration thing that Amsterdam has going on. And, he's off there like 5,000 miles away. And they can't control him. Like, the letter's going to take 3 months to get back and forth, and they don't even know if he's going to listen. So maybe this way they're, making it a little more palatable for him to listen, saying, oh, we agree with you, they really are horrible, but we don't have a choice. Something like that. So I think it's a combination of factors. It's always been an interesting thing for me to look at. I'm not, it's hard to get inside the heads of these people and to know, how honest they're being or how cagey they're being about what they're saying. But it's just a fascinating moment in time because what happened to these Jews? Mercantilism has won out. Medieval anti-Semitism has lost this round. And it's a fascinating moment in time. I often teach this as, sometimes you see ideology changing in one set of correspondence like that, or in one document, or in one painting. And this is one of those amazing transition moments where he writes medieval anti-Semitism and they write back mercantilism. And mercantilism wins. And it's like this incredible moment in history where you see it. Like, usually change happens very slowly over time, this and that. You don't often get to juxtapose it that vividly. And in this case, you really do. So what happens after this correspondence? So the Jews stay. They stay in New Amsterdam. But Stuyvesant doesn't give up so quickly. He prevents them from serving in the volunteer home guard. He prevents them from trading and owning real estate. He prevents them from holding public office. He does all kinds of things that, he tries to get away with, putting all kinds of restrictions onto them. So I want to talk for a second about the volunteer home guard, because I think that that's a really important, really interesting thing. So they don't have, they have some kind of an army probably, but they have a volunteer home guard that guards people's homes in New Amsterdam. And everybody has to serve. It's part of your service for living in the community. But the Jews aren't allowed to serve. And not only are they not allowed to serve, but they have to pay a tax to replace themselves. So what does that mean about them? It means that they're being seen as not loyal somehow, right? The Jews are not to be trusted. They're not allowed to be in the volunteer home guard because they're not trustworthy. And that's a very common sort of medieval trope. It's a trope today. I mean, you know, we see every once in a while a politician will say something, or somebody in American policy, somewhere in the world, or somebody will say something about, well, the Jews, you know, we just have to, you know, we have to realize they have dual loyalties. And, you know, whenever you hear that phrase, dual loyalties, you should be like, Because what does that mean? It means we're not loyal to America, or we're not loyal to France, or we're not loyal to England. We're somehow not to be trusted. And this is what this is about. Like, they're not to be trusted. They are not going to be good guards for the community because they're not trustworthy. They're not going to really protect other people in the community. So Asher Levy and Joseph Bar Simon, who are the two of those people who came on that first ship, they filed petitions with the court in 1655 in New Amsterdam, and they say, look, either relieve us of the tax or let us serve in the guard. It's not fair. And they have a fight for 2 years about it, and after 2 years, they win. There's a street named after him. It's from the corner of East 23rd, Asher Levy Place. I bet you didn't know that. And they win. So that's a really interesting thing, not just from the rights side, meaning they got the right to serve in the guard, because, I mean, is it really so great to have to serve in the guard? No, it's not so great. The fact that he wants to serve in the guard is partially based on the fact that he doesn't want to pay the tax, but it's based on something else too. Why do people want to serve in the guard?
Because they want to feel like first-class citizens.
That's right. That's exactly right. They bought in, right? They've bought into this community. They've bought in, just like they bought into the community in Amsterdam. And they want to be recognized as people who have bought in. It's a huge theme that we're going to see going forward with this group of Jews. The fact that they buy into the society, they say, we now have standing, we have rights, because we're putting our legacy with you. We're going forward with you. We're holding your hands and going forward with your society. We're different, yes. We want to observe differently. We want to worship differently. But we're part of you. And we want to serve in your guard. And we see that's going forward. I mean, we have a long history in this country of doing that. But it begins here. So they win. And they get the right to stand watch and not pay the tax. This is not the only battle that is won. In December of 1655, Dutch troops capture, there's a Swedish, the Swedes also had a lot of territory in America, mostly in the Midwest, but they also had some territory along the Delaware River. And Stuyvesant refused to issue trade permits to Jewish settlers for that new territory. Now, you've got to have the trade permits. Like, the Delaware River is a key trading, tributary. You needed the river to ship things, and they were trading fur, and they were trading all kinds of things over that river, and they needed to be able to trade there. That's how the Jews made money. The Jews were almost universally involved in trading and banking in the New World until the 20th century, really. In the late 19th, early 20th century. They were peddlers or traders. That's what they did. So if they don't give trade permits to the Jewish settlers, they're really taking away their ability to make money. So Levy and others of the Recife 23 right back to the Dutch West India Company. They're right back to Holland again. And they say, come on, he's not letting us make a living. And again, the company defends them and writes back and says, Peter Stuyvesant, you can't do this. From now on, you have to let the Jews trade, and you have to let them own real estate. You don't have to let them have public office. We don't trust them that much. They didn't let them open retail shops for some reason. I'm not sure why. A retail shop was not okay, but trading was okay. They were not allowed to establish a synagogue yet. That didn't come until the British took over. That you can see why what their problem was with that. But they were allowed to trade, and they were allowed to own real estate. And in 1656, Asher Levy was granted one of the first trading permits. He actually, in 1657, petitioned to receive a butcher's license, which he received in 1661. And the butcher's license explicitly said in it that he did not have to slaughter pigs. He did not have to slaughter pigs, which was a big thing. That was something that showed that, it was a butcher's license, but it wasn't just a butcher's license like everybody else. It was a special butcher's license that was for Jews. So by the time we get to the end of the Dutch period, the Jews have made a name for themselves. They've made themselves safe. They have showed themselves to be a part of this community. They've bought in. They want to serve in the guard. They want to trade. They want to have a butcher shop. They want to be a part of the community. And they've demanded their rights. And they have, in large amount, they've won those rights. Restricted to some degree, but largely they've gotten what they wanted. In 1664, the British take over. And interestingly, the people of New Amsterdam put up very little resistance. Nobody really liked Peter Stuyvesant that much. He was not very nice to anybody except for his own kind. So when the British came in, everyone was basically like, okay, have fun, Peter. We will not miss you. The Jews immediately swear allegiance to the British crown, and all the rights they had under the Dutch are transferred into the rights that they have under the British. And in 1671, Levy becomes the first Jew to serve on a jury in North America. 1671. Okay. So what are the implications of this story? This is, to my mind, a really powerful and foundational story about American Jewish history. And it has a lot of messages that should resonate with us today. And it teaches us a lot about sort of how Jews became so free here. So what do you think? Why is this story important? Which it is very important.
It's interesting to me how it sets the pattern for the relationship, or the perception of the relationship between Jews and money vis-a-vis the non-Jews. That,
Yeah.
that this is a really deeply ingrained stereotype.
For good and for bad, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but it's been like that
Forever, right? Even in medieval
other
times.
countries as well.
Right, for sure, even since medieval times. But now it's already a thing in America. Like from minute one, it's already a thing.
But
in
it's
America.
interesting because most people, I'm sure most non-Jews who use it as a derogatory epithet against Jews don't understand the history behind it,
Right.
where it all comes from.
For sure not. Right, exactly. And it actually is rooted in really interesting things. It's rooted in anti-Semitism. I mean, why did Jews have those trading networks? They had those trading networks because they were expelled from Spain and they knew each other and they had to make a living. So they sort of had to create that economic reality because of what happened to them. And at the same time, like, how did money become power? It was when the society changed into a mercantilist society.
There's a definite difference between the countries in the south, Spain and Portugal, and the countries in the north.
Mm-hmm.
And does that basically have to do with the difference in religion? That in the south there they were Catholic, in the north they were Protestant?
So Jews tended to do better in Protestant countries, not always, but they tended to do better in Protestant countries. It makes sense, right? Because the Protestants were used to being subjugated by the Catholics. So, but not always. I mean, the Protestants could also be pretty bad. I mean, Peter Stuyvesant was Protestant. So, but yes, as the world changes, I mean, Spain and Portugal lag behind a little bit in terms of the Protestant Reformation. They're still pretty Catholic today, and the Jews are still not there. They're the most. They were very successful. The Spanish and Portuguese communities at eradicating their Jews. They've done a really good job, but they're really not there still to this day. Have any of you been to Spain? I'm dying to go. You've been to Spain?
Well, just for a few days.
Yeah. So there's evidence. There's a lot of evidence of the community that was, but it never went back.
But
So
what's interesting is the emphasis on the mercantile, the manner in which they made their living. historically, going way back, that's been that way.
Correct.
Poland and Russia.
Absolutely,
It
correct.
was always bankers or whatever.
Correct, correct.
But it's also interesting that the Jews so quickly shifted their allegiance from Dutch to British.
Right.
That's
Right.
questionable.
Right. That's very interesting that you point that out
No, it's
because
smart.
right, they were being smart, but it's a little
Smart.
right. It is a little. It's funny because
A two-edged sword.
the reason it's particularly funny is because England expelled their Jews in 1290 and didn't let them back in until 1656. So these Recife 23 had already landed in New Amsterdam before the Jews were allowed back into England. 350 years they were gone. So it is interesting that, the Dutch had already been, very accepting of Jews for 100 years by this point, well, almost 100 years. And England just let them back in. And yet they're like, all right, well, see you later. They're being very smart, right? Whoever's in power, we're your friends. The Jews have been very good at that throughout history. Whoever's in power, we like you. Because you have to, right? You have to in order to survive. There's another piece that I think is really interesting. So obviously we see that there's this dying of the old anti-Semitism, the old medieval anti-Semitism, and the birth of this new mercantilism that's going to allow Jews to be more successful. There's another piece of it that's really fascinating, I think, which is that America is really far away from Europe. It's really far. And that comes back to your comments about England. Because why are they so eager to transfer over their loyalty to the British? Well, they don't care. The British are 4,000 miles away. Like the actual British are 4,000 miles away. So, they don't care that they left them out for 350 years. They're fine with that. And as we go forward in American Jewish history, you see that the fact that America's far away from Europe is really important. It allows American Jews to be free of anti-Semitism that exists in Europe, and we see still to this day America, it seems to be changing, but America has a different relationship to anti-Semitism than European continent. It also allows Jews, as we're going to see, to not be as committed Jewishly because the communities, then it's hard for us to imagine now, but then Europe was the center and we were the periphery, big time the periphery. We weren't even worthy of being the periphery. So it allows Judaism to develop in a very different way here. The other two things that I think are really important is that we see here that the sort of way that the Jews set themselves up for success was not only by drawing on their connections and their power, but also by saying, we're part of you. And that's something that Jews have done in America forever, right? Starting at this point, and we continue to do it today. Sometimes we try to out-American the Americans. And it's a very, very common trope throughout American Jewish history that we position ourselves as very, very loyal Americans. There's an amazing book I very highly recommend called History Lessons by Beth Wenger. She's a professor at Penn. And she wrote a book about how American Jews write the history of American Jewish history. So it's a book about how history is written. It's a history book about how history is written. And she argues in the book, and she shows the most unbelievable examples of how Jews position themselves as the best Americans. And not only as the best Americans, but as the reason that America has religious freedom. Over and over again. They trumpet the Asher Levies of the world. They trumpet Benjamin Cardozo. They trumpet various people throughout American Jewish history. There's a big gap between Asher Levy and Benjamin Cardozo, but who fought for religious freedom and who sort of gave that extra push to America to insist upon living up to their ideals of religious freedom. So they're not separatists. They want to be part of the community. And last but not least, the Jews are not bashful about asking for their rights. Even though they're Jews, and even though the history has not been kind to them over the past few hundred years or more, they're not bashful. And they go to court, and they write letters, and they stand up for themselves. They don't hide. They don't cower in a corner. They go to court and sue if they feel their rights aren't being properly maintained. And that's another thing that Jews in America have been very good at over the centuries.
They've always done that even just in the Jewish community. Slow cut, or it's not right.
Right.
We didn't get to do Korban, Pesach, we want another time. They fight for what they want.
That's right. Jews are really sort of like we're into champion rights, championing our rights. Yeah.
And it's amazing that Washington wrote that letter.
Yes, we're going to look at that letter. Do you know what the letter this is? Yeah.
So that they were influenced
Right.
already.
Right.
By
Oh, yeah.
1789 or whatever.
Yeah. So yeah, it's the amazing thing about that letter is that he copies the language that they wrote to him, which we'll see. We'll look at it probably next week.
But I think that's partially, and maybe mostly due to the fact that their power base was the fact that their Jewish money in the Dutch East country. So they were really fighting under an umbrella.
That's 100% true, and it's not to be dismissed. It is incredibly important. It is incredibly important that they knew that they had the safety of of their money and their connections. And we still really try to operate that way today. I mean, we connect, we use our money and our connections to help Jews all around the world today as well. And that's a really important thing. You go to you sit on boards of directors of things, and especially like what they do with women's philanthropy, and they always say, when you give philanthropy, you are making a statement. You are, you're staking a claim. You're being powerful because you're choosing what to fund and you're choosing how to wield your power, and it's really important to do that. And they did it.
Were there non-Dutch Jews at this point in the New World, and how were
No.
There weren't.
No, there were previously, but they left. They were single men who came, traded, and left.
Because I'm curious to see how, as things developed, whether the community remained so unified. Because, for example, when the German Jews were entrenched and the Russian Jews arrived, that wasn't such a
Right.
Wasn't such a hunky-dory story.
Right. They do stay, we'll see. By the time we get to the Revolutionary War, there are about 2,500 Jews in America. Between 2,000 and 2,500. Because Americans don't ask for your religion. We can never know for sure exactly how many. Europeans always ask for your religion. But there were Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews, and they all went to Shereth Israel. So the second synagogue in New York City was B'nai Jeshurun, and I think it was founded in 1830 something like that. It was late. I mean, late. It wasn't late, but it was 175 years after Shereth Israel. So they did remain under that aegis of Shereth Israel for a long time. And it's interesting, when they do part ways, it's partially because of the Ashkenazi-Sephardi divide, because B'nai Jeshurun is founded as an Ashkenazi synagogue. But it's also partially because the newcomers were more confident and wanted to stand up for Jewish rights abroad more than the Shereth Israel people were willing to do. And in the 1840s, they parted ways pretty strongly because there was a blood libel that happened in Damascus in 1840, and there was a boy who was kidnapped in Italy in the 1840s who, you may know this, you're nodding, the story. His name was Edgardo Mortera. He was kidnapped by his nanny and baptized, and he was a Jewish boy, and he was raised as a Christian. He became ultimately a priest, and the Jewish community all around the world was up in arms about it, and B'nai Jeshurun's community wanted the United States government to write a letter to Italy and say, you can't do that. So there were a number of instances where that happened. So they ended up parting ways not only religiously, but also because of the sort of desire to stand up for themselves in a way that the Shereth Israel community wasn't willing to do. But they do stay unified for a long time because there's nobody here. Where they aren't unified is they have a hard time, and we'll turn our attention to this next week, they have a very hard time keeping Jews religious. Identified 100%, passionate about their fellow Jews, totally no problem. But keeping them observant in this country where it was so difficult, there was such an enticing and welcoming external culture, there's no kosher food, there's one synagogue in New York City, there's only a handful of synagogues in the whole country, that is going to become the challenge that keeps them from sort of being able to stay unified. And they use all kinds of great techniques to sort of muscle everybody in. It doesn't really work that well, and they get into all kinds of fights. And the only thing they're able to really hold over their fellow Jews' heads is the cemetery. They say if you don't keep Shabbos, you can't get buried in our cemeteries. That's sort of like the colonial Jewish way of keeping people involved and keeping the members of the shul. We won't let you get buried. There were no secular cemeteries, and the Jews wanted to be buried in Jewish cemeteries. They kept them. So just to sum up, so our time is just about out, Uber. We're going to leave this group of Jews here in the 17th century. They've set a groundwork. They've set a foundation of Jews who are well-connected, who are proud to be well-connected, who are not afraid to use their connections, who are not afraid to stand up for their rights, and who are buying into the community in a very powerful way. And that's going to set a stage for the American Jewish community for centuries to come, as we've discussed. And I think they're pretty amazing people. I mean, I always, I wonder what it must have been like for them to be dumped on those shores and to not have any money and not have any power and to be saved by their fellow Jews in Amsterdam and to have to sort of push their way through this very anti-Semitic governor, sort of force their way into this society. They did it. They did it. While I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, obviously they were still discriminated against and they still weren't totally equal. They did pretty well. They did pretty well. And that's going to set the stage for going forward for an American Jewish community that is pretty self-confident and pretty able to rely on its power and pretty eager to self-advocate. Obviously, there are periods where that does not hold true. It doesn't hold true in the 1930s at all, as we know. And I think that we're very divided today in terms of we don't have a unified message as a Jewish community, for good and for bad. But for the most part, I think over the 350 years since the Recife 23 Jews arrived, they set a stage for a kind of a pattern that the community has followed since then. And it's different. It's different than the Jews of Europe. The Jews of Europe are much less willing to stick their necks out than the Jews of America, even today. I mean, maybe even more so today, because things are so difficult. So they're very interesting people. They lay us on they set us on a path that's going to be an interesting path to follow forward. So yeah.
You said there was no rabbi until 1840.
Yeah.
Were there shochettim? Were there
Yes.
ohalim?
Yes, they're called religious functionaries. Yes, there were lots of them. Teachers.
You said Asa Levi became a butcher.
Yes.
Was he a kosher butcher?
He was a kosher butcher, yeah. How he knew how to be a kosher butcher, whether he was really a kosher butcher is unclear. There was a lot of sort of fancy stuff going on. But
But he didn't do pigs.
he didn't do pigs. But there were people who led davening, shlichei tzibur, that kind of thing. And there were melamdim who came to teach the children. And there were shoftim and moalim who came. But no rabbi till 1840. And he had a hard time when he came.
Is it among the Germans really around 1850 where many of them came and brought rabbis? And
Yeah,
so forth?
that's when it happens. The first one comes in 1840. He's from Bavaria.
Yeah.
And he's very frum and he has a very hard time here. He comes to Baltimore. But yeah, over the course, a lot of Germans come. Yeah.
Isn't it also true that whenever new Jewish immigrants come, the Jewish community is active, very active to support them, to bring
Yes.
them in, to provide
Yes.
them like hayas and other
Absolutely, and as
When
negatively
Russians came
as
in,
the Germans felt about the Eastern Europeans,
they created the
they
Russian
still
community.
supported them. They held their nose, but they
Right.
supported them. That's actually my research in my dissertation has a lot to do with how they had a very tendentious and difficult relationship. But yes, absolutely, the Jews always support the next level. The only time I would say that it probably differs fairly significantly is in this time, because by the time you get to the German migration, which begins in 1820 and really in earnest in 1840, these Jews have all intermarried and they're gone. Not all, but the vast majority of them. They don't last. And we're going to talk about that. One of the classes will be about how they sort of try to struggle with the intermarriage thing, which was a very big problem here, very, very big. So they don't really help the German Jews who come because they're not really here anymore. They do the best they can, but there aren't a lot of them. Maybe 5,000 in 1840, 10 maybe.
How long does the Dutch company influence remain in effect?
Until the day they walked out of New Amsterdam in 1664. They are very powerful. Oh, you mean in
How
Europe?
long? In America.
Oh, in America.
They kept working
Right.
under that.
Right. Oh, they 100%. They kept working it. They kept working
So
that
how long
connection
did that last?
till the British took over.
I see.
Yeah, and when the British took over in 1664, then the Dutch West India Company was irrelevant. But yeah, they used them until the very end. They even after they were allowed to stay, they kept on writing back to them every time they felt their rights were being infringed upon. They would write a letter to the Dutch West India Company.
And how did the model change under the British? Was it purely a governmental model, or was also sort of this mercantile government partnership?
It was. England was definitely also mercantilist in the same way that the Dutch were. But their government was much more focused. It was less connected to the British sort of home front and more focused on just in America.
But was there an all-powerful company like the
No,
West Indies? Or
no, it wasn't like that. The Jews were very, very free under the British. There wasn't a lot of they didn't need intercessors. They didn't need help. The British were once the Jews returned to England, it very quickly became a very comfortable place for Jews, and they had really complete freedom. And that transferred to the New World as well. So they didn't really need to intercede with anybody.
When there were Jews in Philadelphia, there were Jews in
Savannah, Charleston.
in Charleston.
Yeah.
When did those
They
also
come
come
now.
from?
Once the British come, those Jews come. There are also many of them are Dutch still, because Dutch Jews go to England, and so a lot of them are Dutch, and British, and Europe, and German, and all kinds of Jews. But they settle in Rhode Island and Savannah, Charleston, Richmond, Philadelphia, New York. I think I said all 7. Yeah, there were 7.
To a small degree, but to still noticeable, Jews to this day maintain their influence through political parties to certain segments.
100%. 100%. I mean, every time my husband goes to APAC with the students, he comes back and he says to me, "It's an unbelievable machine. Like, it's an unbelievable machine that's going on there." And it's you have to sort of like. You hear the anti-Semites on one hand saying, "Oh, they control everything and they're trying to use their money and throw it around," and on the other hand, you're like, "Well, yeah, yes, we are doing that, and we're going to do that because we have to do that." And it's kind of a tension in many ways that it still absolutely exists today, 100%. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We'll continue.